as a duty to myself, my family, and mankind at large, I propose to give a full and true statement of all that I know and all that I did in that unfortunate affair, which has cursed my existence and made me a wanderer from place to place for the last 19 years, and which is known to the world as the Mountain Meadows Massacre. The superiority that I claim for my statement is this: all that I do say is true, and nothing but the truth.
I've been interested in the series of articles running in the American Weekly about the Mormons, especially what's been said about the Mountain Meadows Massacre way back in September 1857. I'm the only person still living who was in that massacre, where the Mormons and the Indians attacked a party of 137 settlers on the way to California, murdering everybody except 17 children, who were spared because they were all under 8 years of age. I was one of those children, and when the killing started, I was sitting on my daddy's lap in one of the wagons. The same bullet that snuffed out his life took a nick out of my left ear, leaving a scar you can see to this day.
A company of immigrants from Arkansas emigrating to California arrived and camped at a spring in the west end of Mountain Meadow Valley on the 3rd or 4th September, 1857. On the 9th of said month, and near the said spring, 115 to 120 people were inhumanely massacred. A massacre of such unparalleled magnitude on American soil must sooner or later demand thorough investigation. I have availed myself over the last 12 months of every opportunity to obtain reliable information about the said emigrant company and the alleged causes of and circumstances which led to their treacherous sacrifice.
My father was George Baker, a farmer who owned a fine tract of bottomland on Crooked Creek near Harrison, Arkansas. He and my grandfather, like a lot of the other men folk at the time in our part of the country, had heard so much about the California gold rush of '49 that they got the itch to go out there. So my father and some of the other men from our neighborhood went out to California to look over the lay of the land. They came back with stories about gold that would just about make your eyes pop. There wasn't anything to do but for everybody in the family to pack up, bag and baggage, and light out for the coast.
About the 7th of September, 1857, I went to Cedar City from my home in Harmony by order of President Haight. The word and the command of Isaac C. Haight were the law in Cedar City, and to disobey his orders was certain death. Be they right or wrong, no saint was permitted to question them. Their duty was obedience or death. Haight told me all about the train of immigrants. He said that the immigrants were a rough and abusive set of men.
Our family joined forces with the other settlers from the neighboring farms under the leadership of Captain Alexander Fancher, and the whole outfit was known as Captain Fancher's Party. It wasn't made up of riffraff. Our caravan was one of the richest that ever crossed the plains, and some people have said that it was one of the reasons the Indians attacked our folks, to get their goods.
That they had, while traveling through Utah, been very abusive to all the Mormons they met. That they had insulted, outraged, and ravished many of the Mormon women.
Conflicting statements were made to me about the behavior of this emigrant company while traveling through the territory. I have accordingly deemed it a matter of material importance to make a strict inquiry to obtain reliable information on the subject. Not that bad conduct on their part could in any degree palliate the enormity of their crime, or be regarded as an extenuation. The result of my inquiries enables me to say that the company conducted themselves with propriety.
In the first place, the members of our party came from a section of the country not far from the district in Missouri and Illinois, where the Mormons had been mighty badly treated. If you've been reading Mr. Robinson's articles in the American Weekly, you'll recall how the Mormons were driven out of Missouri into Illinois, where Joseph Smith, their prophet and the founder of their religion, and his brother Hiram were assassinated. Then they were driven out of Illinois, and after suffering all sorts of hardships crossing the plains, they finally got themselves established in Utah. So it is only natural that they should feel bitter about anybody who came from anywhere near that part of the country where they had had so much trouble. I'm sure nobody in our party had anything to do with the persecution of the Mormons in Missouri and Illinois, or anything to do with the assassination of Joseph Smith and his brother. But that didn't make any difference.
That these vile Gentiles publicly proclaimed that they had the very pistol with which the prophet Joseph Smith was murdered, and had threatened to kill Brigham Young and all the apostles.
The word got around somehow that somebody in our party was bragging about having in his possession the very same pistol that was used to kill the Mormon prophet, and that he even said he aimed to use it on Brigham Young, who had taken over the leadership of the Mormons. So far as I know, there wasn't a word of truth in that, but the rumor got around right after we reached Utah, and it made a lot of Mormons see red.
That when in Cedar City, they said they would have friends in Utah who would hang Brigham Young by the neck until he was dead, before snow fell again in the territory. They also said that Johnston was coming with his army from the east, and they were going to return from California with soldiers as soon as possible, and would then desolate the land and kill every damn Mormon man, woman, and child that they could find in Utah. That at many points on the road they had poisoned the water, so that all people and stock that drank of the water became sick, and many had died from the effects of poison. Also that they had given poisoned meat to the Corn Creek tribe of Indians, which had killed several of them, and their chief, Konosh, was on the trail of the immigrants and would soon attack them.
Persons have informed me that whilst they're encamped, they poisoned a large spring with arsenic and the meat of a dead ox with strychnine. 20 Indians and some cattle died from drinking of the poisoned water, and Indians from eating the poisoned meat. This ox died, unquestionably, from eating a poisonous weed which grows in most of the valleys here. It is by no means uncommon for cattle to get poisoned and die from the effects of this weed. 1 or 2 Indians died from eating of the dead ox, but I have not been apprised that this excited any of them against the emigrants. And after this strict inquiry, I cannot learn that even one Pavant Indian was present at the massacre. That an emigrant company as respectable as I believe this was would carry along several pounds of arsenic and strychnine, apparently for no other purpose than to poison cattle and Indians, is too improbable to be true. I cannot learn that the Pavants had any difficulty with these people. The massacre took place only about 100 miles south of Corn Creek, and yet not any of these Indians were present. Bad white men have magnified a natural cause to aid them in exciting the southern Indians, hoping that, by doing so, they could be relied upon to exterminate the said company and escape detection themselves.
Then somebody started working the Indians up against us by telling them our party had been poisoning springs and water holes to kill their horses. Now that just isn't so. Nobody in our party would do a thing like that. Even if they had been mean enough, they wouldn't have been such fools as to do a thing like that in a country filled with Indians that were none too friendly to begin with. At any rate, we sure did get a mighty unfriendly reception when we finally did reach Utah. By that time, the Mormons didn't have much use for anybody who wasn't a Mormon. Off and on, ever since they took over Utah, the Mormons had been bickering with the federal government, insisting that they had a right to run everything to suit themselves. It finally got so bad that President Buchanan issued an order removing Brigham Young as governor of the territory and appointing Alfred Cummins to take his place. And just before we landed in Utah, the Mormons heard that Cummins was on his way out, backed up by an army of 2,500 men. That made the Mormons mad as hornets. So mad, in fact, that Brigham Young issued a proclamation defying the federal government and proclaiming martial law. But the members of our party didn't know anything about that and walked right into the hornet's nest.
I was then told that the council had a meeting that day to consider the matter, and that it was decided by the authorities to arm the Indians, give them provisions and ammunition, and send them after the immigrants, and have the Indians give them a brush. And if they killed part or all of them, so much the better.
Some writers say that officials of the Mormon Church stirred the Indians up and kept egging them on until they attacked us, and then told their own folks to jump in and help the Indians finish up the job after tricking our men into giving up their guns. But the Mormon writers insist that nobody with any real authority in the church organization knew what was going on until it was too late for them to stop it, even though they tried their best. They admit, though, that there were some Mormons mixed up in it. And years after it was over, they laid most of the blame on John D. Lee, who was Mormon and an Indian agent.
The Paiute Indians inhabiting the southern portion of this territory are divided into 10 bands, roaming from Beaver Valley to the California line, and have received and are receiving considerable assistance from the whites. These Indians received their instructions from white men.
My orders were to go home to Harmony and see Carl Schurz, my son-in-law, an Indian interpreter, and send him to the Indians in the South to notify them that the Mormons and Indians were at war with the Mercats, and bring all the Southern Indians up and have them join with those from the North, so that their force would be sufficient to make a successful attack on the immigrants. On my way from Cedar City to my home at Harmony, I came up with a large band of Indians and the Moquitas and Big Bill, 2 Cedar City chiefs. They were in their war paint and fully equipped for battle. They halted when I came up and said they had a big talk with Haight, Higby, and Klingensmith, and had got orders from them to follow up the immigrants and kill them all, and take their property as the spoil of their enemies.
This affair began by a surprise. The emigrants were encamped by a spring, from which there is a ravine. Along this ravine, the Mormons and Indians crept to the spring during the night. When the emigrants arose in the morning, they were fired upon, and some 12 or 15 of them killed. The emigrants then seized their arms and defended themselves so bravely that, after 4 days, the Mormons and Indians had not succeeded in exterminating them.
They met several hundred strong at the meadows and attacked the immigrants Tuesday morning just before daylight, and at the first fire, as I afterwards learned, they killed 7 and wounded 16 of the immigrants. The latter fought bravely and repulsed the Indians, killing some of them and breaking the knees of 2 war chiefs who afterwards died. The 2 chiefs who were shot in the knee were in a bad fix. Along toward evening, the Indians again attacked the immigrants. This was Wednesday. I heard the report of their guns and the screams of the women and children in the corral. They made a determined attack on the train on Thursday morning about daylight. At this attack, the Clara Indians had 1 brave killed and 3 wounded. This so enraged that band that they left for home that day and drove off quite a number of cattle with them.
On the morning of September 7th, our party was just sitting down to a breakfast of quail and cottontail rabbits when a shot rang out from a nearby gully, and one of the children toppled over, hit by a bullet. Right away, the men saw that we were being attacked by an Indian war party. In the first few minutes of fighting, 22 of our men were shot down, 7 of them killed outright. Everybody was half scared to death, and I reckon the whole crowd would have been wiped right out then and there if Captain Francher hadn't been such a cool-headed man. He had things organized in next to no time. All of the women and children were rounded up into the corral, formed by the wagons, and the men divided into 2 groups, one to throw up breastworks with picks and shovels, and the other to fire back at the Indians. Fighting kept up pretty regularly for 4 days and nights. Most of our horses and cattle were driven away. Our ammunition was running out. We were cut off from our water supply. Altogether, it looked pretty hopeless, and I don't think our men would have ever surrendered if John D. Lee and his crowd hadn't tricked them.
The substance of the orders were that the immigrants should be decoyed from their stronghold and all exterminated, so that no one would be left to tell the tale, and then the authorities could say it was done by the Indians.
According to the way I heard it, while we were trapped down there in the valley, just about perishing for lack of water and food, John D. Lee and some of the other Mormons held a strange kind of prayer meeting in the woods, out of view from our camp. They knelt down and prayed for divine instructions. Then one of them, named John M. Higbee, who was a major in the Mormon militia, got up and said, "I have evidence that God has approved of our mission." He said all of our party must be put out of the way, and that none should be spared who were old enough to tell tales. Then they decided to let the Indians kill our women and older children, so no Mormon would be guilty of shedding innocent blood. They figured that more than likely all of our men were guilty of some sin or other, if it wasn't anything worse than hating Mormons, and really should be killed. But maybe the women and older children were innocent of any wrongdoing, and it seems Mormons prided themselves on being right scrupulous about shedding innocent blood.
Soon after breakfast, Major Higbee ordered the two Indian interpreters, Carl Schurz and Nephi Johnson, to inform the Indians of the plan of operations and to place the Indians in ambush so that they could not be seen by the immigrants until the work of death should commence. This was done in order to make the immigrants believe that we had sent the Indians away, and that we were acting honestly and in good faith when we agreed to protect them from the savages. William Bateman was then selected to carry a flag of truce to the immigrants and demand their surrender, and I was ordered to go and make the treaty after someone had replied to our flag of truce. Bateman took a white flag and started for the immigrant camp. When he got about halfway to the corral, he was met by one of the immigrants that I afterwards learned was named Hamilton. They talked some time, but I never knew what they said between them. Brother Bateman returned to the command and said that the immigrants would accept our terms and surrender as we required them to do. I was then ordered by Major Higbee to go to the corral and negotiate the treaty and superintend the whole matter. As I entered the fortifications, men, women, and children gathered around me in wild consternation. Some felt that the time of their happy deliverance had come, while others, though in deep distress and all in tears, looked upon me with doubt, distrust, and terror.
But anyway, on the morning of September 11th, John D. Lee and another Mormon came down toward our camp, carrying a white flag, and our men sent out a little girl dressed in white to show they were ready to come to terms. Then Lee came on down to the camp and said the Indians had gone hog wild, but that the Mormons would try to save us and take us all to Cedar City, the nearest big Mormon settlement, if our men would give up their guns. Well, our men didn't have much choice. It was either stick it out and fight till the last of us was killed or starved, or else take Lee up on his proposition, even though it did sound fishy.
This horrid affair was finished by an act of treachery. John D. Lee, having washed the paint from his face, came to the emigrants and told them that if they would surrender themselves and give their property to the Indians, that the Mormons would conduct them safely back to Cedar City. The emigrants then surrendered with their wives and children.
I knew that I was acting a cruel part and doing a damnable deed. My hesitation was only momentary. Then, feeling that duty compelled obedience to orders, I laid aside my weakness and my humanity and became an instrument in the hands of my superiors and my leaders. I delivered my message and told the people that they must put their arms in the wagon so as not to arouse the animosity of the Indians. I ordered the children and wounded, some clothing and the arms, to be put into the wagons.
So the guns were all put in one wagon, sent on ahead. Then the wounded and young children, including me, my two sisters, and my baby brother, were put in another wagon. My mother and father had been wounded during the fighting, so they were in the wagon with us children.
I hurried up the people and started the wagons off toward Cedar City. The women and larger children were walking ahead as directed, and the men following them.
It's funny how you will recall unimportant details after so many years. I remember, for instance, that the blankets we had with us in that wagon were red with black borders.
I knew that I had much to do yet that was of a cruel and unnatural character. It was my duty with the 2 drivers to kill the sick and wounded who were in the wagons, and to do so when we heard the guns of the troops fire.
After the wagon I was in had set out, the women and the older children followed us on foot. Then the Mormons had made the men wait until the women and children were a good ways ahead before starting the men out single file, only about 10 feet apart.
When the men came up, they cheered the soldiers as if they believed that they were acting honestly.
I think my grandfather must have been in that procession. Betty and I never could find out for sure just when he was killed. All we could learn was that he was killed during the massacre.
And we were fully half a mile from Major Higbee and his men when we heard the firing. As we heard the guns, I ordered a halt, and we proceeded to do our part.
Each of our men had an armed Mormon walking right by his side. They said that was because the Indians might start acting up again. That wasn't the real reason, as you will soon see.
I have said that all the small children were put into the wagons. That was wrong. For one little child, about 6 months old, was carried in its father's arms, and it was killed by the same bullet that entered its father's breast. It was shot through the head. I was told by Haight afterwards that the child was killed by accident, but I cannot say whether that is a fact or not. I saw it lying dead when I returned to the place of slaughter. I first heard one gun, then a volley at once followed. McMurday and Knight stopped their teams at once, for they were ordered by Higbee, the same as I was, to help kill all the sick and wounded who were in the wagons, and to do it as soon as they heard the guns of the troops.
The line had been moving along slowly for some little distance, when all of a sudden the figure of a white man appeared in the bushes with Indians all around him. I've heard that he was Higbee, and that he shouted, "Do your duty." Anyway, the Indians opened up fire and then charged down with their tomahawks. Each Mormon walking along with our men wheeled around and suddenly shot the man next to him, killing most of them on the spot. The women and older children screamed at the top of their lungs, scattered every which way, but the Indians ran them down. They poked guns into the wagons too and killed all the wounded. As I have already said, my father and mother were killed right before our eyes.
McMurday and Knight got out of their wagons. Each one had a rifle. McMurday went up to Knight's wagon, where the sick and wounded were, and raising his rifle to his shoulder said, "O Lord, my God, receive their spirits. It is for thy kingdom that I do this." He then shot a man who was lying with his head on another man's breast, and the ball killed both men.
One of the Mormons ran up to the wagon, raised his gun, and said, "Lord, my God, receive their spirits. It is for thy kingdom that I do this." Then he fired at a wounded man who was leaning against another man, killing them both with the same bullet.
I also went up to the wagon, intended to do my part of the killing. I drew my pistol and cocked it, but somehow it went off prematurely, and I shot McMurday across the thigh, my pistol ball cutting his buckskin pants. Knight then shot a man with his rifle. He shot the man in the head. Knight also brained the boy that was about 14 years old. The boy came running up to our wagons, and Knight struck him on the head with the butt end of his gun and crushed his skull.
A 14-year-old boy came running up toward our wagon, and the driver, who was Mormon, hit him over the head with the butt end of his gun, crushing the boy's skull. A young girl, about 11 years old, all covered with blood, was running toward the wagon when an Indian fired at her point blank.
By this time, many Indians reached our wagons, and all the sick and wounded were killed almost instantly. I saw an Indian from Cedar City, called Joe, run up to the wagon and catch a man by the hair and raise his head up and look into his face. The man shut his eyes, and Joe shot him in the head.
Last November, I passed my 85th birthday, and at the time of the massacre, I wasn't quite 3 years old. But even when you're that young, you don't forget the horror of having your father gasp for breath and then grow limp while you have your arms around his neck, screaming with terror. You don't forget the blood-curdling war whoops and the banging of guns all around you. You don't forget the screaming of the other children and the agonized shrieks of women being hacked to death with tomahawks. You won't forget it either if you saw your own mother topple over in the wagon beside you, the big red splotch getting bigger and bigger on the front of her calico dress.
The Indians then examined all the wounded in the wagons and all the bodies to see if any were alive. And all that showed signs of life were at once shot through the head. I did not kill anyone there, but it was an accident that kept me from it, for I fully intended to do my part of the killing. But by the time I got over the excitement of coming so near killing McMurdy, the whole of the killing of the wounded was done. There is no truth in the statement of Nephi Johnson where he says I cut a man's throat.
In the midst of all the commotion, the two Dunlap girls I spoke about before, Ruth, who's 18, and Rachel, who was 16, made a wild dash for a clump of scrub oaks on the far side of a gully. Hidden in scrub oaks, they must have thought they were safe, but they weren't. Their bodies were found later, and the evidence is that they suffered far worse than any of the other women.
Just after the wounded were all killed, I saw a girl, some 10 or 11 years old, running towards us from the direction where the troops had attacked the main body of the immigrants. She was covered with blood. An Indian shot her before she got within 60 yards of us. That was the last person I saw killed on that occasion.
Albert said another Indian found the girls and sent for Lee. At first, Lee wanted to kill them then and there because they were old enough to tell tales, but the Indian begged him to wait a while because they were so pretty. Ruth was old enough to realize what that meant, so she dropped to her knees and pleaded with Lee to spare her, promising she would love him all her life if he would. But according to Albert, Lee and that Indian mistreated those poor girls shamefully and then slit their throats. I don't know whether or not Lee himself attacked the Dunlap girls and murdered them, or was directly responsible for what happened to them. But there doesn't seem to be much doubt that they were brutally mistreated by somebody before being murdered, just as Jacob Hamblin's Indian boy said they were.
About this time, an Indian rushed to the front wagon and grabbed the little boy and was going to kill him. The lad got away from the Indian and ran to me and caught me by the knees and begged me to save him and not let the Indian kill him. The Indian had hurt the little fellow's chin on the wagon bed when he first caught hold of him. I told the Indian to let the boy alone. I took the child up in my arms and put him back in the wagon and saved his life.
There's been a lot of argument about how much part the Indians played in the massacre and how much of it was due to the Mormons. Some people even saying that the Indians didn't have anything to do with it at all, and that some of the Mormons disguised themselves as Indians just to lay blame on them. I can't say as to the truth of that, but I do know that my sister Betty, who died only a few months ago, always insisted that she had seen a lot of the Mormons down at the creek after it was all over, washing paint off their faces, and that some of them, at least, had disguised themselves as Indians.
About the 1st of September last, we saw a party of from 20 to 30 persons, either Indians or in the disguise of Indians. We then, and yet, believed them to be whites in disguise. 5 or 6 of these real or pretended Indians had long, heavy beards, and 3 of them had yellow hair. we noticed none of them had the long, coarse black hair of the Indian. These pretended Indians spoke our language well as any American speaks it. There was no brogue on their tongues, and they talked to one another as well as to us.
After all the parties were dead, I ordered Knight to drive out on one side and throw out the dead bodies. He did so, and threw them out of his wagon at a place about 100 yards from the road, and then came back to where I was standing. I then ordered Knight and McMurdy to take the children that were saved alive and drive on to Hamblin's ranch. They did as I ordered them to do.
At any rate, while the Indians, or a crowd of savage-looking men that appeared to be Indians, went around making sure that all the grown-ups were dead, giving them a final shot to anyone who looked as if they had a spark of life left in them, and also robbing the bodies of valuables. While that was going on, the Mormons rounded up all us children and took us off to their homes.
The bodies were all searched by Higby, Klingensmith, and William C. Stewart. The search resulted in getting a little money and a few watches, but there was not much money. We then went along the field and passed by where the brethren were at work covering up the bodies. They piled the dead bodies up in heaps, in little gullies, and threw dirt over them. The bodies were only lightly covered, for the ground was hard, and the brethren did not have sufficient tools to dig with. I suppose it is true that the first rain washed the bodies all out again, but I never went back to examine whether it did or not.
I have the honor to report that this morning, accompanied by the detachment of men furnished by your orders, I proceeded to inter the remains of the men, women, and children of the Arkansas emigrant train massacred by the Mormons at the Mountain Meadows, Utah Territory in the month of September 1857. At the scene of the first attack, in the immediate vicinity of our present camp, marked by a small defensive trench made by the emigrants, a number of human skulls and bones and hair were found scattered about, bearing the appearance of never having been buried. Also remnants of bedding and wearing apparel.
In the spring of 1859, Major James H. Carleton passed through Mountain Meadows and stopped there long enough to gather up the bones of the victims of the massacre. He found 34 skeletons and buried them in one place, under a heap of stones. Put up a cedar cross with these words on it: "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord."
While going back, I passed the bodies of several women. In one place I saw 6 or 7 bodies near each other. They were stripped perfectly naked, and all of their clothing was torn from their bodies by the Indians.
On examining the trenches or excavations which appear to have been within the corral, some few human bones, human hair, and what seemed to be the features of bedding only were discerned. Proceeding 2,500 yards in the direction north 15 degrees west, I reached a ravine 50 yards distant from the road, bordered by a few bushels of scrub oak, in which I found portions of the skeletons of many bodies, skulls, bones, and matted hair, most of which, on examination, I concluded to be those of men.
Later on, Captain R.P. Campbell passed through Meadows and found 26 more skeletons, which he also buried there. That only accounts for about half of the victims. Nobody knows what became of the other bodies.
I walked along the line where the immigrants had been killed and saw many bodies lying dead and naked on the field, nearby where the women lay. I saw 10 children. They had been killed close to each other. They were from 10 to 16 years of age. The bodies of the women and children were scattered along the ground for quite a distance before I came to where the men were killed.
Here, too, were found masses of women's hair, children's bonnets, such as are generally used upon the plains, and pieces of lace, muslin, and calicos, and other material, part of women's and children's apparel. I have buried 13 skulls and many more fragments. Many of the skulls bore marks of violence, being pierced with bullet holes, or shattered by heavy blows, or cleft with some sharp-edged instrument. The bones were bleached and worn by long exposure to the elements, and bore the impress of teeth of wolves or other wild animals. These, with other remains there found, were buried under my supervision, under the hill upon the hillside of the valley.
In later years, a granite slab was put up in the meadows, and on it were these words: "Here 120 men, women, and children were massacred in cold blood in September 1857. They were from Arkansas."
The children that were saved were taken to Cedar City and other settlements and put out among different families, where they were kept until they were given up to Dr. Forney, the agent of the United States who came for them.
I remember that we were treated right well in the Mormon home where we lived until we were rescued. I never will forget the day we finally got back to Arkansas. You would have thought we were heroes. They had a buggy parade for us through Harrison. Remember, I called all the women I saw mother. I guess I was still hoping to find my own mother, and every time I called a woman mother, she would break down crying.
After the dead were covered up or buried, but it was not much of a burial, the brethren were called together, and a council was held at the immigrant camp. All the leading men made speeches. The speeches were first, "Thanks to God for delivering our enemies into our hands." Next, thanking the brethren for their zeal in God's cause. And then, the necessity of always saying that the Indians did it alone, and that the Mormons had nothing to do with it. From that day to this, it has been the understanding with all concerned in that massacre that the man who divulged the secret should die. He was to be killed wherever he was found, for treason to the men who killed the immigrants, and for his treason to the church. Such were the orders and instructions from Brigham Young down to the lowest in authority. I have told this statement just what I did at the Mountain Meadows Massacre. It is my fate to die for what I did, but I go to my death with a certainty that it cannot be worse than my life has been for the last 19 years.